I'm very excited to show you today some details about how the movie Loving Vincent was created. It's the first long-form animated movie that's completely painted by hand by a group of 125 professional oil painters. And I'll talk to you and show you various clips. Many of you might have even gone to the screening we had on Sunday, or maybe seen the Italian version of the film that's been playing in the theater here in Turin, but even if you haven't, I'll hopefully give you a good example of what the movie's about. So, in a nutshell, Loving Vincent brings to life over 100 of Vincent Van Gogh's iconic paintings, like, for example, on your left, Dr. Gachet, or Armand on the right. And to give you an example of what bringing these paintings to life might look like, I'll give you a quick sample of many that you'll see today. But the reason that the filmmaker, who I'll introduce in just a minute, chose to do this project was to thank Vincent for writing all the letters he wrote and painting all the paintings that have been a big inspiration to the director of this film. And she wanted to explore the mystery around Vincent's death. So here's what bringing to life Vincent's paintings like Dr. Gachet might look like.
You must be the young man who's been waiting to see me.
So just a quick example. The 820 letters that Vincent wrote primarily to his brother Theo during his life tell the story of a struggling artist who is suffering with mental anguish, mental illness, who failed at 3 careers before, at age 28, he picked up the pencil and the brush and started doing art. He was basically, in his own mind, a failure and a rejection. He only sold 1 painting out of over 800 that he did in his lifetime. So you can imagine someone like the director, Dorota Kobiela, a Polish artist and animator, at a certain time of her life when she was about 28, 29, she found herself battling with depression and found these letters very helpful to her. And she wanted to, as a homage to Vincent, create a short film. Originally, the idea was a 7-minute short animated film in which she really took at the letter a phrase from Vincent's final letter that he wrote to his brother, in which he said, "We cannot speak other than by our paintings." And she wanted to really run with that idea and take his paintings and bring to life to tell his story. Her husband, Hugh Welchman, a British director, won in 2006 an Academy Award for Pere and the Wolf, a short stop-motion film. He convinced her to make it a long-form movie after seeing people waiting in England and in London for 3 hours outside of a museum to go see not the paintings, but the letters inside glass cases in a museum. And he said, "This is a great idea. I think more people want to see this, or should be able to see this." So he coaxed her into abandoning the idea of painting it herself as a 7-minute short, and instead taking on the role of being the director and being the art director of a group of 125 other painters. So they worked for several years on the story, working in concert with the archives at the Van Gogh Museum. They came up with a story that takes place a year after Vincent has died, but the idea was that they wanted to tie together as many of Vincent's paintings as possible to be the subjects and the places where this movie happens. And it's possible to do that because Vincent, lacking other subjects, painted the things and the people that were right around him as he was painting for these 9 years. And so the material was there to do this project. And appropriately, the story they came up with involves a letter. One of these 820 letters. It didn't happen this way in reality, but they imagined what would happen if one of the letters fell behind a couch or something and was found after he was dead. His really good friend, Joseph Rouland, the postman in Arles, France, wanted to get Theo this letter that was been sitting kind of lost for a while. But he can't go. He can't leave his job as the postmaster. So he asks his son, Armand Rouland, to do this task. His son reluctantly takes on this job to deliver the letter, but learns when he goes to Paris that Theo has also died in the meantime. He proceeds to go to Auvers, where Vincent spent the last 70 days of his life, and meets some people who Vincent painted and who were there during Vincent's days and have something to tell him, each with a slightly different story about the versions of the facts. And so he reluctantly becomes kind of a detective to uncover the truth of how Vincent died. When I visited for the first time the studio in the far north of Poland where this film was painted, I saw on the walls a number of design paintings where a core team of artists had painted keyframes, you could think of them, in oil paints to give the look and the color of each of the places this film the movie takes place, all based on some Vincent artwork. And they're not just copying the paintings. That's an important detail I want to show you several examples of. They're really reimagining a still image that Vincent produced into a moving medium like film. And so the first example, the most simple, is when a character just happens to occupy a painting and it's just part of the background. He's just doing some kind of activity in a painting that Vincent did of Montmartre in France, in Paris. Other times they get a little bit more creative and play with the camera angle. So one of the most famous paintings, the Café Terrace at night, they may do a panning shot where you see the postman trying to convince his son to go on this task, to go on this letter-delivering mission. Yet at other moments in the film, they take even more creativity and come up with an idea or a backstory of how a painting like this soldier might have ended up in the place where Vincent painted him, getting in a fight and slumping down against the wall, for example. So, of course, a lot of people told Hugh and Dorota that this was going to be an impossible job to make a film like this. And they said, well, why don't you just slap a filter on live action and it will look like Van Gogh? And they did use a little bit of CG for camera movement shots to block and get the perspective correct for the painters. But in the end, they decided after evaluating some filtered-based approaches, that the only way to really deliver the look that would correctly pay homage to Van Gogh was to paint it on canvas in oil paint like Vincent did. And so what they did was adopt a technique where they separated the painting job from the acting. They did 4 weeks of shooting on a €5 million budget for the entire film. So Chris Pere mentioned yesterday that a $30 million film was a low budget. So this is a shoestring, tiny budget film. So they filmed first all of the movie as live action, and then divided the different shots among a group of 125 painters, split across 3 different studios in Greece and 2 in Poland, to produce the painted version. And hopefully I'll convince you by the end that while a few of the reviews of the movie mention that it's just rotoscoping, I'm going to hopefully prove to you that it's quite a bit more than simple rotoscoping. There's a lot more of the hand of the artist involved in all the shots that look like Vincent's work. So in 2011, they were trying to understand whether the long-form version of the movie was even possible, and the director, Dorota, did an experiment on herself, and Hugh dressed up as the postman, and they did a few tests, and those came out okay. But in 2012, they did a few more tests with Dr. Gachet, an actor standing in, some tests where they were trying some drawing approaches, as well as additional painted animation, and they convinced themselves that this, if they could come up with a repeatable process, this could be, as long as they had enough people to work on it, they could get this movie finished. 12 frames per second of oil-painted animation for a 90-minute movie makes 65,000 oil paintings. And if you lay those side by side at the dimension, the panels were about 1 meter by 60 centimeters. that the artist painted on, that would cover the area of metropolitan London and all of Manhattan together. So it's a lot of painting that needed to be done. And so they spent several years toying with ideas of how to make this process repeatable. And they ended up with a kind of a workstation that the artist sits in. Above and behind the artist is mounted this pair of projector and Canon DSLR camera for taking high-resolution digital shots at a fixed distance from the canvas. Each painter worked in a workstation, painting on their canvas at a 45-degree angle, and they used the Dragonframe software that's very familiar to anyone who's doing stop-motion animation, so that they could observe the work that they were painting and see the frames that they're working on. This particular artist was at the Annecy, I remember seeing you there, the Annecy festival this year doing a live demonstration, and in about 10 hours of sitting there painting, he was able to do a half of a second of film. So this was a little earlier in the day when he only had 2 frames done, but just that's the basic workflow. Now, even though $5 million seemed pretty low for a budget, they still found it very hard to find financing for this movie. Every conversation started with the question like, what super successful movie adopted this movie-making technique? And the answer, honestly, was no movie has adopted this technique. And so even though people liked the idea, artistically it was beautiful, a lot of people just said pass. And so they figured maybe if people could see it, they would have more confidence that this was more than just an idea. And they used Kickstarter to try to raise enough money to train 30 initial painters in Van Gogh's style. Of course, they would have to already be very accomplished oil painters, but they couldn't expect them to already know how to paint like Vincent. And so about 800 people put some money into the Kickstarter project to get that initial effort started. And this is what the studio looked like, a big room like this with these workstations set up. Each painter assigned a few seconds of film to be translating into Vincent's artwork style. And so let's zoom in on what one painter would do. Let's say they just got assigned a shot. They would spend a few hours painting the first frame to look just like a still image. But then the fun starts. They take a digital picture of that frame for posterity and then begin to scrape using the projector on top of their workstation. They can decide when to project or hide the image of the next frame, and that shows them where the head of the character might be moving. They'll scrape away the paint and paint the background that this movement uncovered, paint the new shoulder position, take another digital picture, and so on, doing that 12 times a second to produce animation inside this painting. So, of course, not all scenes were equally complicated. Sometimes a scene like this conversation between the postman and his son taking place at the Yellow Cafe, the Cafe Terrace, has a simple solid color background and he's just moving a little bit. So there's not too much scraping involved.
Live longer. You'll see. Life can even bring down the strong.
The actor's Chris O'Dowd, if you've ever seen the IT Crowd or something. He plays the postman in the movie. And of course, the other end of the spectrum is when the director, they didn't do this too many times because it's quite expensive for the labor, but a panning shot where every pixel of paint is changing in every frame, like this, imagine a drone took what I'm about to show you, meant that every frame they had to scrape the entire canvas and do another painting for the next 12th of a second. So those kind of like panning shots were ones that could take, in some cases, many months of multiple people working on them to finish. So I'm going to talk next about some interesting technical challenges that were involved in making the film. The directors chose to film this, to paint this at the Academy ratio 4:3 instead of 16:9, mostly because that was closer to the dimensions of most of Vincent's paintings. But of course, he did do some paintings that were vertical, which meant they needed to imagine what might have been on either side of Marguerite Gachet as she was playing the piano in a particular scene. Or in other cases, since the story is taking place in summer, Vincent might have painted the chosen locale in the wintertime. So they sometimes needed to change the color palette to make it look like it happened in the summer. And so they would study other Vincent paintings done in the summer season to inform their choice of color palette changes. Now, getting a little more ambitious, when Vincent painted a famous cemetery in Arles called the Alleykamp, he did it from a particular viewpoint. But sometimes the director wanted a camera shot that would get in the face of the actors, and so they had to imagine what Vincent might have seen if he set his easel up the other direction, looking down that same alley of coffins or sarcophagus. And then because both directors were big fans of film noir, and it also was a kind of detective story of Armand investigating, they explored how Vincent might have painted nighttime scenes like this.
What the? Oi, come here!
So there are even some action shots in the movie, and very cleverly done. Even though Vincent might not have ever painted something with that kind of lighting, they did so much painting that they started to get intuition of how his brushstrokes and color choice might have looked. Now, another really clever thing that they did to give even more creativity to the painters, rather than simply cutting from one scene to another through black, or just a simple switch from one scene to another, they asked the painters if they could come up with painted transitions to make the end of one scene morph slowly into another. And there are many examples of that in the film, but here's one that I chose to include. He punches this guy, and then the end of this scene blends into the beginning of him now drunk and asleep at the bar. So they've done a lot of clever transition paintings like that. Now, inevitably, Vincent did not paint every moment of his life. He was a child at one point. As I mentioned earlier, he didn't start painting till he was 28. So they wanted to tell a particular story, and some moments had no painting to go with them. So they chose to deal with that by reflecting those moments in flashback, where a character that you encounter in color in one of Vincent's paintings recollects some facts about Vincent, and they painted those to look like late 18th century photographs in black and white. Of course, they're also oil painted with a gray palette, and these are more like traditional rotoscoping, where it's a quite accurate copy of what was projected onto the canvas. But they really get some cool effects with the smoke and the lighting. So, there's two cinematographers that worked on the live action shoot, I think one of which has probably been nominated, if not won, an Academy Award, Łukasz Żal. So another thing that Vincent was really intensely famous for, he wanted his portraits to, 100 years from then when he painted them, still show what he called the soul of the sitter. So he wanted someone to be able to really recognize who that person was. And so it was important to the filmmakers that they pick actors that looked like the paintings. And so here's one example, Eleanor Tomlinson, if anyone watches a British series called Poldark, she's an actress in that. She got cast for Adeline Revue. That's the live action actress, looks a lot like the original painting. So I'm going to show a little bit longer clip now to illustrate one sort of quandary that the painters had when Armand comes to Paris hoping to find Theo Van Gogh to deliver this letter. his action moves across 6 different Vincent paintings. And in the period when Vincent was in Paris, he was influenced by Impressionists and other interesting art styles that were happening right around him, and he was trying some of those styles too. So the style of these 6 paintings won't look the same, and they had to decide whether they made them all look consistent or do they stay true to the original Van Gogh painting, and they decided to do the latter, and they figured people would give them a little credit and go with that and be able to follow. So Armand takes a train from Arles to Paris. You get painted reflections in the glass. Different style of painting. This looks quite different. The figure almost kind of abstract. This was maybe the 5th painting. There might be 7 paintings. Then this one over Montmartre. Then here, concentrate on the clouds. So they did stick to that style across those different works. So as I mentioned before, 125 painters worked on the film, and then a small team of digital artists helped with the preparation of the scenes to get them ready for the painting. And then in some small examples that I'll give, they did some digital corrections of the digital images taken after. So here's an example of Vincent's paint supplier that he painted. His nickname was Pere Tanguy. Some concept art was done to imagine a scene in the painter's shop where Armand comes after finding that Theo is dead, trying to figure out, well, where could I take this letter next? Hoping to learn where else he can go. A design painting uses the color key and the example from the previous slide that can inform when they do the live action filming what props they need, like a basic table or a dresser like that. And the actor is filmed on green screen. The digital team then inserts the matte painting behind to get rid of the green screen. And then an important thing which helps you understand why this isn't just rotoscoping, the painters, because they're painting with these thick impasto lines, they're not like tracing with a super fine pen. So they just basically need the outlines and to see where the edges of things are. And so the digital team applies some filters to take away detail, and the artist uses a combination of the matte painting and the projected thickened line live action to do their work. So let's look at the final shot.
6 months after we buried Vincent, Theo was dead too.
Wow, the 2 of them. So how did Vincent die?
He shot himself in the fields above Auvers.
That's definitely one theory, but the movie explores a lot of different alternative possibilities. This is another example, Louise Chevalier. She's the housekeeper of Dr. Gachet. Show you quick what the green screen footage looked like. Take out the green screen and put in a matte painting similar to what I showed before. Again, cut out detail and thicken the lines, add contrast for the painters. And then this is what a painted cell, you could call it, looks like. And of course, what you see at the movie theater is just a standard cropped rectangle from that canvas. So let's look at this shot.
God bless.
Oh. Glad to see you're honouring God. Not like your friend.
My father's friend.
You know Vincent actually did his ungodly act on a Sunday. That's not the half of it. I saw him that day.
Then the last example I'll show is an example of when sometimes there's not a single painting that influenced a given shot, but maybe an assembly of elements that Vincent produced in multiple pieces of artwork. This is a doctor who examined Vincent after he returned to his hotel with a bullet wound in his abdomen. And the character design was based on a painting that Vincent did called Sorrowing Old Man. But for the background, the digital team worked on a matte painting that included elements from drawings for the kettle and the fire, the shoes from a painting Vincent did, some books and a copper kettle from a different painting, and then a table from his famous bedroom in Arles painting. And so, of course, the set has hardly any props, just some chairs, basically, and where the fireplace is. But then the digital team inserts the mat, and we get a scene that looks like this. This is the first time I'll show a scene that only has part of the painting done. So you can see a little bit as the movie progressed. They first cut it as a live-action movie, and then slowly more and more of the movie was painted. Each week they would produce the current version, and some more was painted. So this scene has some painted and some live-action still there.
Dr. Masery?
Yes? I would never send a report normally. I mean, this was Gachet's case. Then I read that the patient died 2 days later in his room. So I felt that I should.
One quick example of a kind of digital correction that was done, wherever there was information in the archives or written about Van Gogh, they made sure the story stayed faithful to that historical record. During I believe the spring of 2016, a book came out by Bernadette Murphy, who had done research and found a document where a doctor in Arles indicated exactly where his ear had been cut when Vincent cut off a part of his ear. The belief when they first painted the movie was that he cut off just a small part of his ear. But after seeing this evidence, the filmmakers decided to go back and have the digital team correct every shot in which Vincent's ear appeared and make it look like the whole ear was gone, just to have historical accuracy. So they didn't repaint the whole frame just to fix that. Some Photoshop retouching to take brush strokes and make the ear, a little less of the ear be there. It's kind of interesting. So in the movie, you meet a lot of different characters that are all from Vincent's paintings. And I'll close by just mentioning that because the film had about 900 shots, and I explained how each shot started on a canvas and then various levels of scraping was done, at the end of the shot, they would put it away to dry in a rack, and that final frame stayed on the canvas. And after a few months, the oil paint is dry, and they're selling these animation cells, if you will, these paintings. A few they kept for a traveling exhibit, which started in Holland about 2 weeks ago and might visit other museums in the world, hopefully. But on the lovingvincent.com website, they have for sale what frames are left to buy one to hang in your own house. Or if you're on a lower budget or just want a handbag or a tote bag, the Fine Art America website sells some of the exclusive images from the movie on various things like mugs and t-shirts that don't cost too much.